So I wrote this week about the mutually assured destruction that undergirds any actual peace that you observe among human beings. That peace is not a commitment to worthy sentiments like the Golden Rule or the non-aggression principle. Peace is the consequence of the recognition on the part of each party to that peace that their self-interest is best served by engaging each other peacefully and cooperatively rather than aggressively, combatively. And that mutually assured destruction is a result of each party recognizing that they are essentially equally matched and that any conflict is likely to result in damage to each party's interest, more damage to each party's interest than they stand to gain by predation, by larceny, where that equality of ferocity and martial prowess don't exist, you will find crime. Not necessarily, that can be the case where a person who is much stronger than another person will behave honorably and affectionately rather than in a predatory fashion. But where you find predation, you find that asymmetry. You don't find predation where the bad guy's going to end up dead, or not for long, because the bad guy will end up dead, which is a good thing. It rids the world of bad people. This is one of the mistakes that we make by attempting to delegate self-defense is we keep bad guys alive. The people that we delegate our self-defense to intentionally keep bad guys around in order to scare us with them, to keep us clamoring for more protection from the people who represent the greatest peril to the peace, the so-called peacekeepers. All of that's by the way, and sooner or later, someday I will take it on. I've dealt with it in the past. To my satisfaction, in any case, I've dealt with it, and if I need to do more, I'll do it later. But in response to this essay that I wrote about mutually assured destruction, I had a question come in over the transom. The question amounts to, in an ongoing relationship, in other words, not a one-off encounter, in an ongoing relationship, what is the self-adoring response to aggressive displays from the other party? So, a marriage, a job, a friendship, relationship with your kids, with your parents. Ongoing relationship, a relationship that will have a future, typically based in storgic love or based in mutual economic self-interest, such as a job. The boss is barking at you today. What should you do about it? What is the most self-adoring thing you can do about it today and as a matter of praxis, as a matter of ongoing habit? How should you respond to that? This is a really interesting question. I mean, really interesting question. I think it's leading me to a brand new discipline of study that I'm calling rancor management, not anger management, rancor management, how to manage rancor in your ongoing relationships. And I don't think I'm really ready to talk about it yet. I wrote a few hundred words about it on Friday, and I wasn't happy with them. And I don't know that I'm happy with my full answer to this question yet, but I know I have places where I can go with it, and I wanted to talk about them today. So we can think of this as being Rancor Management 099. It's not quite Rancor Management 101 yet. It's not a complete field of study, but I'm going to stick my toe in the water in a couple of ways to see where we can get with it. The topic that I thought I wanted to talk about was maintaining boundaries in ongoing relationships, and that will matter. But before I get to that, I want to go through some things that I've talked about in the past, reorganizing them in a different way so that we can sort of see them all together. I call it the anatomy of recurring conflict. And recurring conflict is a wonderful idea just by itself, to understand that the dispute that you're having with your spouse or your boss today is the same dispute you had yesterday and the same dispute you had last week and last month and last year. You go through the same things over and over and over again, and you go through them in the same way over and over and over again, and the end of the instant dispute, the end of the dispute that you're involved in today, will be identical to the way the dispute ended yesterday and last week and last year. That we go through the same things over and over again, and they always start and end the same way. They always proceed along the same path, and we never stop to think about, why am I running this railroad track again and again and again? Why am I always coming back to the same place where we started? Only tomorrow it's a little bit worse than it was today because we went through this conflict today, and the day after that it'll be a little bit worse again, worse and worse every time we go through this conflict loop. And why doesn't somebody do something to break these chains? This is right up my street. Breaking chains is what I'm all about. So think about Greg. I think about Greg all the time. Driven incandescent, but really off the charts driven. Greg's motivation in the world is accomplishment. I love to get things done. I can't stand not getting things done. The hardest job in the world for me to do is nothing. I can't stand to do nothing. It makes me completely crazy. What I idealize most in the world is realization. In other words, having things finished. What I abhor most in the world is frustration. In other words, things not getting finished. And accordingly, my dispossibility, the thing that makes me inherently dissatisfied with other people, no matter what they do, no matter how hard they try to please me, I will become dissatisfied with them. If I'm not being thoughtful, I will become dissatisfied with them because they are incapable of producing all the work that I want produced. They are insufficiently productive no matter how productive they are. That failure to produce at my idealized level of accomplishment, which is 110%, that was on Celebrity Apprentice, Lou Ferrigno, 110%. 110% seems small to me. 1,000 and 500,000%, that's excellent. If you could produce everything I want, not necessarily an infinite quantity, but if you can constantly exceed my expectations, constantly deliver more to me than I can manage, then I may not be dissatisfied with you, but you're not going to do that, and therefore we arrive at dispossibility by default. Simply by default of thoughtlessness, actually. It's my failure to acknowledge that when people are doing their absolute best for you, they can't do any better than that, and therefore you need to celebrate and appreciate what they're getting done and not moan and groan and whine about what they're not getting done. But if I permit that frustration over that dispossibility to overtake my mind in the absence of rational thought, if I behave inappropriately, my behavior will be expressed in the repulsive act by impatience. I will express my impatience, and in expressing my impatience, I will set a conflict loop into motion. So let's have my conflict that I've now introduced. Let me afflict a sociable personality. I happen to be married to one, and so this is a very common story in our house. Greg getting frustrated over the lack of productivity and expressing his impatience in a rancorous way. Hopefully not too belligerent, but belligerence is in the eye of the receiver, the ear of the receiver, in the hunched up shoulders of the receiver. When you're on the receiving end of me, it can be a memorable experience. DI is prick boss. That's what it is. I'm a DI, and a DI is a prick boss. Mercurial, explosive, often unbelievably productive, and can achieve amazing, insanely great, outrageously huge results in productivity. But the means of achieving that productivity with other people involves a great deal of expressions of impatience, abrasion, of ruffled feathers. So I express my impatience to my sociable wife. Her motivation is affection, not aggression. She doesn't seek aggression. She doesn't display aggression. What she idealizes most in the world is the act of loving. She loves to love things. That's why we have all of these critters living here, because there are an insufficient number of people in the world for her to love. She has to love all furry things also. What she abhors most in the world is conflict. And what did I do? I just introduced conflict, didn't I? I introduced conflict, and she abhors it most in the world. What she, her disposable need is commitment, the reciprocal commitment that she expects in exchange for her loving, and my expression of impatience looks a lot less like commitment and more like aggression to her. Again, if she's not being thoughtful, if she's just reacting, this is how she's going to see it. And her response to me is likely to be aggressive. Not to say that she's naturally aggressive, to the contrary, she's naturally affectionate. But I have ruffled her feathers, and in response, I'm likely to get a rancorous response, which will in turn incite yet another rancorous response from me, faster and more aggressive. And her response to me is likely to be faster and more aggressive, and so on and so on. The frequency and the amplitude of the transactions is going to go up through the course of this conflict while it's happening. That if I start off impatient, then she will respond resentfully, and I will respond with even greater impatience or with specific direction. This is where cautious tyranny starts to emerge, is where you try to micromanage people. And she will respond to that micromanagement with still further resentment, and we will carry on back and forth. We don't actually do this, or we don't do it much, and it's always my fault if we do. But this is the way that a topical conflict, an individual conflict, a conflict that is happening in real life, this is the way that it will occur, is according to the empathy strategies that are dictated by your DISC profile. And DISC, again, is a way of understanding how you choose when you're choosing thoughtlessly, when you're choosing without careful, deliberate consideration of the future consequences of the immediate action. And this is why these sorts of things happen, why the aggressive displays become more frequent, because there's less and less thought per iteration, and why they escalate, why they become more rancorous with each iteration. There's less and less thought involved, and more emotional reaction, more and more DISC response, more and more animal behavior, and less human behavior as the conflict proceeds, until you get to the circuit breaker event, or whatever you want to call it, the either the making up or breaking up of that particular conflict. And typically the way that a conflict like this will end is with one person walking away. The person will say something like, well, I'm going to put a stop to this before I say something I'll regret. Well, when you say that, what you're saying is, I've already said things I regret. I don't want to say more of them. Before I say something I'll regret is in the past. That before is a while ago. Possibly with the first aggressive display, but certainly among the aggressive responses, you started saying things that you'd rather hadn't have said, and you assert self-control. You finally do stop to think about the future consequences of what you're doing when you find yourself at a point where you're just about to lob a very destructive bomb into that relationship. And then you break it off if you are wise, and if you don't, in due course you will have broken the relationship, because you can only engage in so much rancor before the relationship cannot survive. This is to be avoided. That idea of dispossibility is immensely valuable, because when you find yourself feeling that dispossibility, that's the point at which you should think. Long before you make any aggressive display. When you realize, in my case, that I'm realizing that frustration building up on me, in Kathleen's case, when she realizes that the very next thing she says could result in a conflict, if you're incandescent, when you're thinking about humiliating the other person, or when you're finding yourself fearing humiliation from that other person, if you're cautious when you start to get that itch that says the chaos is building up on you, when that disposable need is tickling at you, or scratching at you, or annoying you in such a way that you feel yourself on the cusp of making an aggressive display that will damage the relationship, will damage the relationship. That's the point at which you need to stop and think. And the thing I think you most need to think about is the recognition that your dispossibility is impossible, cannot exist in reality. There is no such thing as infinite productivity. There is no such thing as infinite fascination. There is no such thing as infinite commitment. There is no such thing as infinite compliance. And when you try to hold other people accountable to your disposable need, you're actually doing two things. Number one, you're holding them accountable to a need that you can't answer personally because your disposable need is impossible. Not even you can do it. And you are regarding that other person as being you, or as even being an even better you, being your idealized you, or being your idealized other person. In any case, you are robbing your spouse, your boss, your employee, your friend, your child, your father, your cousin. You are robbing that other person of his identity. You are insisting that that other person's identity is not just epistemologically wrong, not just morally unrighteous, not just politically unjust, which you might also insist, but ultimately metaphysically broken. You are insisting that that other person is broken because they can't deliver on your impossible demands. And this is irrational. Really hugely irrational, and in a sense it's anti-rational, because what makes relationships is the differences, not the similarities. Does like attract like? Do opposites attract? We attract people who we are attracted to, and we attract people who share our values in large measure, but what we find attractive in other people is what's missing from us. True. We're looking for balance from other people. The ideal marriage, from my point of view, is the man is DS and the woman is SD. That this is the ideal marriage. I'm DI. I am not ideal marriage material. My wife is SD, and she's so much S that she can counterbalance my weak S to the extent that we work very well as a marriage. We have a great marriage after considerable effort, especially on my part. But what we're looking for from our spouse, especially, is a balance to take our crazy away by counterbalancing it, by being a countervailing force for the crazy that I bring to the world with all of my driven productivity and my incandescent abrasiveness. I definitely need a great deal of sociability that I can't provide for myself, and Kathleen brings that to our marriage. And so for me to fault her for not being me, for not being super me, is doubly absurd, because she can't be super me, but she is amazingly great the way she is, and if I accept her for what she is, then I don't have any need to introduce a rancorous conflict into our marriage. To the contrary, I need to pursue my impulsion strategy instead. The impulsion strategy for drivens is abundance, and that means gifts and high praise, but it also just means, in a marriage, it means loving contact. And as dreadfully impatient as I can be, I try to counterbalance that with an enormous amount of very affectionate displays, and so far it's working. Don't reveal my secret, because if she susses that out, she may dump me anyway. But the chart that I made for this video illustrates the conflict strategies for each one of the DIS types, and if you take your DIS profile and the DIS profile of the other party to the conflict or potential conflict and work through the chart, you can see exactly how your disputes are going to play out, how they have played out all along, how they will play out in the future. And then as soon as you make that recognition that the other person doesn't just have the right to be who he or she is, but cannot fail to be who he or she is, if you recognize that this is yet another example where there is no alternative to the existential, the other person is going to be who he or she is. If you accept and embrace that other person for the unique characteristics that they bring to the relationship and stop trying to shoehorn them into your idealization of who they would be if you got to rebuild them from the ground up, which you cannot do. If you let go of all of that subjunctive nonsense and latch on to the reality of the situation, you not only avoid the conflict in the instant moment, you improve the relationship rather than hurting it, and you improve it every time that you engage in this thoughtful response to your dispossibility rather than in the thoughtless response. With the result that over time, conflicts will happen less frequently. When they do happen, they will happen at a much lower level of amplitude. They will be resolved more quickly because as soon as you engage your thoughtful attention to the problem, you'll realize that the mistake is entirely yours. It's 100% your error. Whether you're offering the initial aggressive display or if you're offering a subsequent aggressive response, every one of those aggressive displays is erroneous because they are damaging to the relationship. And therefore, the thoughtful thing to do is to figure out, how can I make an affectionate display instead if I can? And if I can't, how can I avoid making an aggressive display nevertheless? And so, in answer to the question, what is the most self-adoring way I can respond to aggression in an ongoing relationship, my answer would be to think about how to respond affectionately. And if you can't come up with an affectionate response, make no response whatever, other than to say, I think we may need to take this up later when we're both in a calmer frame of mind. And if the response to that is aggressive, why do you want to neglect this? Why do you want to ignore this? Why do you want to? Because anything that either one of us says while we're feeling rancorous is likely to do more damage to the relationship than any repair we might make in response to that aggression. And accordingly, I choose to wait until we can do this appropriately. Doesn't that make sense to you? This is hard to do, very hard to do, because in a conflict like this, the displays come hot and fast. Even if you're remaining calm, the responses to you are likely to be, or could be, very quick and escalating in aggression even so. But if you can maintain your self-adoration at that moment and say, I know I will admire myself less if I engage in this rancor, and accordingly I choose not to do it, and simply don't do it. Be as affectionate as you can be in the circumstance. Break off the encounter if you need to avoid introducing more rancor to the encounter, and revisit the subject. You can't ignore it. You have to come back to it. You have to deal with it, but deal with it when you both can deal with it calmly. This is the ideal way to do this, to handle this in such a way that you won't destroy the relationship and do enduring damage to your own self-adoration going forward. I have so much more to say about this, but that's sufficient for now. I think that other people are going to be who they are. You will not coerce them into being something else by your rancor, but what you will do is do enduring and possibly fatal damage to the relationship, and at a minimum, you will do enduring damage to your own self-adoration. And this cannot possibly be the egoistic choice. I'm going to have more on this. I don't know how much more. I may end up getting a book out of this, a book called Rancor Management. I'm amazed that I don't get more questions because I approach things in a way that no one else does. I have an enormously happy marriage, which apparently is the rarest thing on earth, and so I would expect to get a whole lot of questions about that, and I never do, or almost never do. But in any case, no matter what, at an absolute minimum, my mind will be improved for having taken up this subject, so I'm grateful for the question. I am enriched by it, and plausibly, hopefully, sometime soon you will feel yourself to have been enriched as well. In the meantime, my name is Greg Swan. This is the Church of Splendor. I'll talk to you again next week.